All right, good evening. It is Tuesday, 7:32, and you are joining us here on Pump Up the Volume, where we amplify the voices of communities and really try to tackle some of the most contentious issues we're facing here in the state of Rhode Island, within our municipalities as a state, and of course, some issues that have stretched far and out into the national stage. So joining me today, as always, we have Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town Podcast. Thank you so much, Bill, for being a great co-host and a leading independent media journalist out there, really pushing the boundaries and really trying to bring back truth to listeners and community members, as well as Mr. Pat Ford, the founder of the Coalition Radio Talk Radio Network, and also a leader in the independent media space and someone who, again, has always been known to push back against the establishment, a seeker of truth, and a bringer of light. Although that light is arguable, we oftentimes do on this show argue, how best to go about that. But it is great just to be here with Pat and Bill. We are missing one member of our show, Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. Roberto is caught up with some of the other work that he does today, but he does send his best, and we're looking forward to having Roberto back next week. So as always here on Pump Up the Volume, we are really trying to not only gauge the pulse of what's going on, but really give you a better perspective on what those issues are and what is going on. And so to start off our day, to start off the show, as always, I'd like to hand it over to Bill, who will give us a rundown of what has been going on in Rhode Island over the past 7 days and what's going on today. Bill?
Well, good evening. And yeah, it's primary day in Rhode Island. So that's, a fairly relevant situation. It's going to be interesting to see how long we have to wait as a state for the results to really be back. When you think about the mail ballots, the early voting, I had some conversations with candidates earlier this morning that had invited me to come out to their watch party or their returns party. Several candidates, all of whom were challenger candidates. And you think about it. I don't know what there will be to break down tonight, unless you can prove that there's such a significant margin of separation, but based on the tally of in-person voting, that the mail ballots would be irrelevant. But we're in primary day, and that's one sort of side of politics. The other side is the more policy oriented element. And I think when we look back on this past week, the decision to go back to school, at least in most districts, all but two, the green light given to go back to school in person for a staggered reentry, but a minimum, a hybrid model of going back into in-person learning. That is obviously the major standout storyline. We saw today the Providence Teachers Union, Mary Beth Calabro and company at the State House demanding a more robust preparation and time before even elementary school students go back in Providence. I had a chance to speak with some of the inspectors, or pardon me, walkthroughers that are engaged in walking through the schools off record, and I was made aware of several major holes, which I'm going to bring up at tomorrow's press conference with the Governor Raimondo and see if they're aware of. But that's the major storyline. We've got crumbling schools in much of the state as is, and now we're going back to school for the most part in the thick of a pandemic without addressing those infrastructure issues. So to me, we got primary day, we got back to school. That's really the story on the street. It's been quiet otherwise with Labor Day, and we'll see where it goes with both of those two narratives over the next week. It should be interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much for the rundown, Bill. So I'm just trying to get a sense. I'd love to move into what you think are some of the most competitive races out there that we should pay attention to. But before we go there, I'm just interested in kind of understanding or seeing if you could help the audience understand what the difference is between the inspectors and walk-throughers, right? Because from my perspective, it almost feels as though somehow or other, by redefining the official role that someone has who is essentially inspecting a school, they would remove some type of moral obligation that that person would have to report what they're seeing. I could be wrong about that. So I'm interested in your maybe giving us some clarification on what the state means or what distinction the state is making.
Yeah, well, they've made the call to after calling them inspectors in some letters to the teachers union, they've made the decision to call it a walkthrough. Part of this is because, look, you hear the term inspector, you think somebody who's got years of experience, somebody who inspects an automobile or whatever. They've got years of anecdotal evidence to help compare and contrast and make decisions. Whereas the walkthrough team, uh, it's comprised of people, many of whom have absolutely no experience in these areas. They went through training, and now they're out sort of collaborating with members of the National Guard, whose role is very unclear at this point, with members of the board, the Department of Education, whose role is very unclear, and a lot of people who are just trained to say, "Hey, look, go in, talk to principals, talk to superintendents, school committee members, and get a sense of whether or not they feel good about things. And if they do, then that kind of means that we're all set." It's really a continuation of punting by the administration to the school districts to make their own decisions, rather than saying, okay, we're going to send quote unquote inspectors in, and if the school district doesn't meet certain criteria, the expertise of those inspectors would be sufficient enough evidence for the Department of Education, the Department of Health, whomever, to step in and say, you know what, X school district or X building or X portion of a building isn't able to open up because they don't meet certain criteria. But as it stands right now, that's not the case at all. It's more a decoration, and as she calls it, the governor calls it, the boots and the suspender and belt approach. These are the suspenders, and they're at best used suspenders with one buckle missing.
How many weeks in a row did I ask specifically the governor and the head of the Rhode Island Department of Education what the skill sets of these people were? Was it 3 weeks in a row, 4 weeks in a row? And they still refused to even engage in any level of real in-depth conversation about what these focus were. And in fact, it was last week we were treated to the notion that these are a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, intergalactic, terrestrial-based warfare group that were going to be dropped in on the schools. And they really didn't have conventional skills per se. They weren't really inspectors, but they were a lead assessment on a Tiger team that was focused preliminary on a needs assessment necessary to culminate in a proactive interdisciplinary force. Now, as you know, nothing I said made sense. And if I can paraphrase one of the great movies of all time, may God have mercy on my soul. But there's never been a there, has there? I like that. Has there ever been a there, here, there? Or was just, do you get the sense that they're just making some of this stuff up on the fly? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Sure. There's no question. No question.
Yeah. Pretty metaphysical there, Pat. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, it just really seems like, there's just a displacement of accountability as always. To your point, Bill, we've seen this administration, or I would say an extension of your point, Bill. We've seen this administration call out in a negative ways districts that have considered not reopening. It just seems like there's always been a backlash when a district says, hey, well, based on those walkthroughs, right, or those walkthroughs, if we're not ready, and then administration comes back and says that, they're not putting in the work. So it does seem like unfair. And look, I'm hoping for the best as well. I'm hoping that the statistics are consistent with what we're seeing in cases that are less than 18 years of age. But we also have to remember that there's another layer to this. It's not only the people that get infected and survive, it's the people that they will infect for being infected and may not survive. So just keep that in mind. We're going to continue to talk about this. COVID-19 is not over. The fall has just begun unofficially, but soon it will be official. And that is not so much something I'm looking forward to, it's just inevitable. So we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But for now, Bill, it is primary day. It only happens, once a year, or a cycle, per se, every 2 years. And so really interested in getting your thoughts on what the more challenging races are out there, and things that may actually, to some extent, change the face of Rhode Island on the local level as well as on the national level uh, if something happens that we don't think will happen, to say the least. So what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on what the races are?
Yeah, big stuff today. Look, the Rhode Island Political Cooperative emerged a little over a year ago, and this is a group that was spearheaded by Maggie Kane and Jennifer Rourke, and your former opponent, actually your former opponent, but a person who ran for governor at the same time you did, Dr. Munoz, Matt Brown. And when it emerged, my question was how much of their efforts are going to be collaborative versus really, just a clearinghouse for political consulting. And I think what we're seeing today is that the Rhode Island Political Co-op, with some exceptions, have found a method to work together to promote progressive ideologies. And we're going to see if that plays out in a positive or negative way. I think that my criticism of the co-op has always been, look, what's going to work in Providence on the east side is not going to work in Hopkinton. So if you have this blanket notion of what it means to be progressive, then that means you're going to run into issues where you're not going to be able to win statewide. Today, though, we're going to see if I think Tara Mack has a very good shot of defeating Senator Harold Metz, who is, by my estimate, a Democratic name only, a religious fanatic, and somebody who is the only person in the entire Senate, including Republicans, to actually vote for continuing conversion therapy, which is essentially therapy that takes a person who identifies as LGBTQAI plus and puts them in a program to try to convert them, quote unquote, back to or try what they believe back to being heterosexual. So that gives you insight into the thinking that goes on with Harold Metz. Tiara Mack, also a person of faith, also a person who brings some reasonable ideas in terms of fiscal policy, but just a more modern and open-minded approach that I think is going to resonate with voters in her district. Lenny Seo taking on President Ruggiero, Senate President Ruggiero. Lenny Seo, really amongst all the other co-op members, quite moderate, other than probably his taxation policies. He's fairly moderate on most issues, and he's a healthcare worker. Senator Ruggiero, Senate President Ruggiero, somebody who has sort of dodged minor scandals one after the other, and although he's got great name recognition, he doesn't have the influence that the Speaker of the House has when it comes to legislative grants, when it comes to community relations. So I think Lenny Seo has a chance to knock off the incumbent president of the Senate, Dominic Ruggiero. And I think lastly, an interesting race is Sam Bell, Senator Sam Bell, known as a, somewhat condescending and if not well-meaning, condescending voice in Rhode Island politics, taking on Joanne Ryan, the majority leader of the Providence City Council, who's trying to present herself as more of a moderate. In this case, I think that the moderate Ryan has a chance to unseat the progressive Senator Sam Bell. And I've spoke with both of those candidates today, as well as their campaign teams, and they both feel really good about where things are at. But those three races, really key to watch. It's going to be interesting. I think that Tiara Mack race is really, really interesting, and it'll be an indictment on, because you have two candidates who are black, you have two candidates who are persons of faith, and you have two candidates who embody elements of the district that they represent or are trying to represent. It'll just come down to, does that district want to modernize their thinking when it comes to, like I said, and somewhat disrespectfully and intentionally, what I believe are fanatical positions that Senator Metz has when it comes to persons or people who are not exactly like him.
Well,
Interesting.
thanks for sharing that, Bill. So, Pat, I'll let you go in just a second. I just want to say, I didn't know that about Senator Metz. I mean, it just blows my mind that someone would
Yeah,
advocate
right.
for that. It's just especially forever, right? But I mean, even you think he would change with the times.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, before Pat, you get your question, and I'm interested if once Pat presents his idea and question, and we go through that, Bill, could you also, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so you don't have to, but it would be interesting to better understand what make the element of Lenny's platform that's not moderate, just to really see where, because he is in the co-op, right?
He's a member of the co-op. Yes. Yep.
Right.
And
And
I would say
I'm
he's a
guessing
moderate within the.
within the co-op. So it's
I
all
would just
relative to, yeah.
exactly right. He's someone who I asked at a press conference, "Are you in favor of the legalization of cannabis?" And he is not. I asked him about guns, and he does not have the most liberal gun position. I've, he's somebody who, on a healthcare basis, wants to. I think that's really where his progressive policies are coming from, more so than in, typical wedge issues that we see play out. That while Lenny, I think, is somebody who believes in doing the right thing, in any case, I'm not so sure that you could say that about the Senate president based on what we've seen. I think that
So what is
he
it?
is a more.
What is it that? Sorry, Bill. So what is
Oh
it
yeah,
that got Lenny into the co-op? Because basically, if it with the issues you've described, it seems like that would be kind of counter. So was it that he wants to tax the rich? Was that like his doorway in? I'm just trying to figure out what is it that kind of brought him in there.
I think so. And he reminds me of Megan Cotter down in Hopkinton, who is also, leans to the right on some gun issues and some other issues that are, who is Megan Cotter, who doesn't have a primary opponent, who is taking on in that Hopkinton, Exeter, West Greenwich, one of the two seats down there in the House of Representatives, where Megan Cotter is not your typical progressive, doesn't necessarily match point for point with certainly Matt Brown or Tiara Mack or Moira Walsh, and certainly Kat Kerwin and folks like that. So it shows that the co-op includes more than just, let's say, far left folks. It includes people. I listened back to October 18th of last year when I filled in on WPRO for Dan York, and it was the day that Peter Nerona indicted Jeff Britt. And what was interesting is I made the whole show about challenging the structure of power in Rhode Island. I brought on Sue Cienki, the chairwoman of the Republican Party. I brought on Matt Brown, the quote-unquote chairperson of the co-op. And what was very interesting was that point for point, during that hour and a half discussion, there was a tremendous amount of agreement on, hey, we need to change the structure of power in Rhode Island. Yeah, we may disagree about certain and major political issues, but there's an overlap of institutionalist versus challenger. And I think Lenny Seo sees himself as someone who identifies as a challenger. And it makes him more like the political co-op than not like the political co-op, just by presenting that mindset, even though he may be to the right relatively of just about every other member of that organization.
Interesting. I'm so curious to see whether that is something that was intentional, or in retrospect, whether the co-op will rethink that for future election cycles. And I'm sure their decision will be based on whether he wins or loses, but it will be interesting to see.
Exactly. Yeah.
Pat, sorry for having interrupted. Pat. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I had that ask the question, Pat. But you can go. I know that you had something to share as well.
Well, two races that I believe are very underreported. One involves Cranston. And the problem with our media in this state is that they're so Providence-Pawtucket-centric that they forget that Cranston is a city, and it's a fascinating role, that the politics takes place, because there are cross currents in that town that are actually incredible. The Alan Fung is term limited, and wrong race. We'll get to that in a second. Ken Hopkins is running against Duke Farina, if you will, for the Republican nomination. And this is largely a Republican-leaning town. One could argue that, of course, is Mr. Mattiello is, in fact, a Republican in Democratic clothing. And interestingly enough, there's very strong political connections, completely underreported by our lazy media, between the Speaker and Mayor Fung. And so now Mayor Fung has endorsed Ken Hopkins. The Duke Farina, Duke is his nickname, Michael Farina, is the city council president and a very successful executive at CVS, certainly well financed. He became infamous or famous for a little bit by having, right at the onset of COVID, of having Mike Farina for mayor face masks. That was his little bit of infamy. He kind of jumped the gun on that. What's the apocryphal question? Too soon? Yeah, a lot of people thought it did. I've interviewed Duke Farina in the past, and he's a powerful figure. He's got quite the machine. What interesting will be to see how the Fung machine runs up against the Farina machine and in Cranston. And, of course, set as a backdrop to that is the up-and-coming race between Mayor Fung's wife and Speaker Mattiello for not for the speakership, but for that House race. That's going to be coming up in November. So that's going to be fascinating to watch. I think one of the most underreported races of this term is Dylan Conley versus our establishment Congressman Jim Langevin. I find Mr. Conley's take on a lot of issues. It's a fascinating mix of a little bit of free market economics thrown in with some arguably progressive positions, but with a solid case of real politic. Now, he's taken on an establishment figure his first time out, and don't know how that's going to go. I don't live in that district, so I don't have a really intrinsic feel for it. But I would say that folks need to watch out for Dylan Conley. I think he's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the future if he's not successful in the upset this time. Mr. Langevin does not have any real legislative record to speak of, and real legislative accomplishments. Doesn't mean he isn't a hell of a guy, but you're running up against a time in American history where track records matter and people's votes matter. People are, I believe, the fallout of the combination of COVID and a much more cynical electorate is the fact that people have become much more knowledgeable about where their candidates stand. It's less and less of a machine issue, less and less of a blue and red. And we're rooting less and less for laundry to a certain degree. And like I said, I'm not sure if Mr. Conley can pull the upset. Defeating an incumbent congressman is quite the task. But I'd be interested in your reactions, Bill, if you had much exposure to Mr. Conley. But I think he is a player, as they say. So
absolutely, yeah.
Go ahead, buddy.
Oh no, I was going to say he's fascinating. I mean, he got in June. He was on the Bartholomew Town podcast last week, and I've talked to him throughout his campaign, and just throughout the day today, I've actually been in touch with him and his campaign, and I just wrote to him right before we started the show, and he's feeling good. His people are feeling really good, and when he first entered, I thought, all right, well, here's an opportunity. This is a guy just looking for a name recognition boost, and if that you could even call it that. But I do think he has evolved, and in fact, I went and picked up some dinner before we started the show, and I was driving back to my studio and thinking to myself, kind of zoning out, thinking, wow, if he pulls off the upset, do we have an actual matchup now of Bob Lancia versus Dylan Conley? And it would be the first time we've had a real congressional race here in my life, really. So
absolutely.
Not that I would. So I think that there's a lot of layers to it, and we'll find out. I think Congressman Langevin, name recognition wise, will, that's going to give him 10, 15 points. But I remarked to Dylan last week when he was on my podcast. I said, man, I was in Newport and driving down Rhode Island Avenue where it intersects with K, which is a fairly wealthy area and an establishment area, and it tapered. 5 out of 7 houses had a Dylan Conley sign set up. So,
well, I think he in a certain way, he's completely unlike Lenny Seal, but at the same time, I use the term realpolitik a lot. Both candidates, I think, approach issues on an issue by issue basis. Sounds cliche, but I think both of these folks have attempted to carve out their own philosophy and are not afraid to share that and not afraid to present it. And that's refreshing, regardless win or lose. We all know that, to compete at that level, you do have to build up a machine. And I think regardless of what happens to either candidate, again, I think they're both here to stay. I don't expect any of them to fade gently into that good night. And I will certainly say that for Sam Bell as well. I consider Sam Bell a friend. Is he in your face? Yes, he is. But remember, and I will take this to my political grave, if you will, out of the entire progressive movement, and I know I hang on this issue a lot. I'll be doing a lot of work in the next year or two on this issue. But when it came down to the stadium vote, there were very few progressives, two, that actually voted against corporate welfare. And that's a character vote. It would have been just as easy for them to go along to get along. A lot of progressives did. And so Sam didn't. And maybe I'm mixing up Sam. Forgive me. I don't know. Sam actually won. Forgive me on that. There have been a number of votes, not the stadium vote, that Sam has stood tall on against all opposition. There's been an awful lot of votes that end in one that Sam has stood tall on. I'm thinking about the young lady who's running, rerunning, if you will, and I'd love to have your comments on that. In, what was it, Warwick? She lost last time.
Janine Cochran.
Yeah, Janine.
Raw.
Yeah, what's happening with that race, in your opinion?
Boy, tough to say. Warwick is a weird place. When I was down there today, I went to Pilgrim and a few places, and I have no pulse on that area. Nothing that I can offer other than to say it's a place that typically is stagnant. You see the Solomon rain and it's the Avedisian rain. It's a place that, and obviously Jim Langevin. So it's tough for me to imagine that being a place where Jennifer Rourke, for example, comes out with a big upset, or Janine Calkin comes out with a big upset. But there's reason to think that voters are looking for an alternative and some kind of change. So I think it's of all years, this might be a year that we see Warwick have a splash.
Right. Janine Calkin voted against the stadium, and I know I used that as a litmus test. Also remember that when it came time to stand up against leadership, as we refer to it here, remember only a handful of people actually stood up and voted against Rubbas Ruggiero, as we say in the state, and Sam Bell was one of them, and he had the most to lose because he intended to stay, as opposed to a certain Pawtucket senator who had paid homage to the machine for her entire life in the Senate, and only had the late stage cards of deathbed conversion, at a time when she probably knew she wasn't going to run for re-election. So I see Sam Bell. I don't agree with him on a lot of issues, but I do see him as a profile in courage there, regardless of his shall we say confrontational style. I enjoy that. So.
I think I've always been of the position, it's my issue with some of the more corporate progressives is this notion that there's a litmus test that you have to pass. So it's really interesting to hear about Lenny. I'm interested in seeing how that race turns out. I've seen Dylan communicate. I think some of his ideas are interesting. I do wonder at times, whether the family lineage of politics in Rhode Island, right? And I think his father's chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Just kind of like how those relationships play into ultimately your leadership role, and whether it's a perpetuation of things we've seen in Rhode Island or not. It's more of a question. I think everyone has an opportunity to do their own thing and step away, but it still isn't a question, especially with Rhode Island politics. Overall, though, what I will say is what's interesting, what will be interesting in terms of today's outcome, really how Rhode Island is defined in a moment of crisis. And I think it obviously you're going to have people in the middle, but I do think it can go either way, right? We can have an instance where people, as a result of fear and uncertainty, both economic and health related, um, look for change, um, or whether they actually rationalize the need to maintain the establishment to provide them with some level of security that they feel they've had, over the years. And we do know that Rhode Island is a quote unquote blue state. We do know that these representatives at the state and federal level tend to bring resources that are just enough. Now that's problematic because it's just enough instead of being more, instead of creating opportunities. But again, this moment, right, in history, it'll be really interesting to see how Rhode Island defines itself, and I think every state's going to define itself differently. So we'll see, by Thursday or Friday, right, Bill, when all the ballots come in. But with that said, we're at 33 minutes today. It's an important day. I know Bill's going to go back out there and catch the waves and get some more information. Pat as well, I'm sure, is going to have some more data collection to do. So I do want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in. My hope is that the information that you've received today is, enlightening and gives you a better sense of what's going on, what candidates are out there. Hopefully you got out there and were able to vote if you fall into one of the parties that you're voting for, because obviously this is part of the democratic process. And even if you didn't hear much about the candidates that you're excited about, hopefully this will balance out your perspective on what might be some of their upcoming opponents. So thank you again. We'll leave our outrage for next week when we have Roberto and when we have a special guest, actually Tiara Mack, who can discuss more about her journey through the campaign trail. And at that point, we'll figure out whether she was able to beat out an incumbent or not. Either way, hats off to all of those that jump into the race, right, and are really, have the courage to do that. It's a hard thing to do. So good luck to all the candidates out there. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you here again next week on Pump Up the Volume at 7:30. All right, take care.
Good night.
Good night.